Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we, grab a whole stack of sources,
Yeah.
really pull out those key insights, and basically give you the shortcut to getting up to speed.
Uh-huh.
Today, we're plunging into machine learning, specifically a topic that gets talked about a lot in theory, but maybe the practical side is less clear sometimes, regularization.
Right.
So our mission, if you will, for this deep dive is to get past the textbook definitions and really explore the regularization techniques that actually work, the ones that, move the needle in real-world ML.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because even for people who do this all the time, that constant battle with overfitting, finding that sweet spot between bias and variance, it's always there, right? And that's what we're getting into.
It really is, and it's easy to get lost in the math sometimes, but fundamentally, regularization isn't just some niche technique for experts, it's truly foundational.
Foundational.
Well, its importance for anyone working with predictive models, or even if you're just curious about them, it really can't be overstated. It's what makes models robust, reliable when you actually deploy them, not just looking good on the training set.
Okay, let's unpack that then.
Right.
Why do we even need regularization? What's the core problem it's solving?
Right.
We've talked before about the bias-variance trade-off, haven't we? And it really comes down to that delicate balance, between underfitting and overfitting.
Exactly. That's the heart of it.
Because the pitfalls are pretty clear. If your model's too simple, well, you get high bias.
Oh.
It just can't capture the patterns, performs poorly.
Doesn't learn enough.
But then if it's too complex, you swing the other way. High variance, unstable predictions. It's basically just memorize the noise in the data, right? Not the actual rules.
Precisely. And that's where regularization steps in. It's the balancing act.
The balancing act, okay.
Its main job, its core function, is to penalize complexity in the model, to stop it from just memorizing every little quirk and noise point in the training data.
So it discourages complexity.
Yeah. You could almost think of it like a little whisper in the model's ear saying, hey, don't get too clever here. Simplicity has power.
I like that.
It guides the model towards generalization, towards finding patterns that hold up on new data, not just reacting to the training set, pushing for a more parsimonious solution.
Okay, so that's the why. We need to stop models from getting overly complex and just memorizing noise. Now, let's get into the how. What are the tools? What are the techniques people actually use that make a difference?
Right, the toolbox. So first up, a really common one is L2 regularization. You often hear it called ridge regression.
Ridge, okay.
What it does, basically, is add a penalty based on the squared magnitude of the coefficients, the model weights.
Squared magnitude. So bigger weights get penalized more?
Exactly.
Right.
The penalty term is added to the loss function. And crucially, it shrinks the coefficients towards zero. But, and this is important, it doesn't usually force them exactly to zero. It doesn't eliminate features.
Okay. So it tames them, but keeps them around.
Precisely. So it's ideal when you think, well, all my features are probably useful to some extent. I just want to control their individual impact, keep things a bit smoother, less sensitive maybe.
Less sensitive to outliers, perhaps?
That too, yeah. By shrinking coefficients, it sort of encourages a more distributed influence across features, makes the model a bit more stable in that sense.
Okay, that makes sense for L2, reining things in. How does L1 Lasso compare then? Is it just a different way of shrinking?
It's fundamentally different in its effect. L1 regularization, or Lasso, applies an absolute value penalty instead of a squared penalty.
Absolute value. Okay, how does that change things?
Well, the math works out such that this absolute value penalty has a really distinct property. It can drive some coefficients all the way to zero.
All the way to zero, so it actually gets rid of features.
Exactly. It performs feature selection as part of the process. So if L2 is about taming features, L1 is like a strict editor. It can actually cut features out entirely if they don't pull their weight enough.
Wow. Okay, so that sounds powerful for simplifying a model.
It really is. The use case is typically when you suspect some of your input features might be irrelevant or maybe redundant. Lasso helps discover the signal and kill the noise, as the saying goes, finds the important stuff, and gets rid of the rest.
That's a really clear distinction. Feature selection versus just feature shrinking. But I wonder, could Lasso sometimes be, too aggressive? Like, what if you have a bunch of features that are kind of correlated and maybe individually they aren't super strong, but together they matter? Would Lasso just kill some of them off arbitrarily?
That is a fantastic point, and exactly the kind of situation where relying only on Lasso can sometimes be tricky. And that leads us perfectly to the next technique, elastic net.
Elastic net. Sounds flexible.
It is. You can think of it as the best of both worlds. It literally combines both the L1 penalty and the L2 penalty.
Ah, so it's a hybrid.
Exactly, the hybrid approach. And it's particularly powerful when you're dealing with those situations you just mentioned, like lots of correlated features, or just very high-dimensional data in general.
And why does combining them help there? What makes it better than just L1 in that case?
Because the L2 component helps to stabilize the feature selection part from L1. When features are highly correlated, Lasso might somewhat randomly pick one and zero out the others. ElasticNet, with that L2 influence, tends to keep groups of correlated features together, either shrinking them all or sometimes selecting the whole group. It's just more stable.
Got it. So it borrows the feature selection power of L1, but adds the grouping and stabilizing effect of L2. Very clever. Now, these methods, L1, L2, ElasticNet, they sound very linked to linear models, regression settings. What about the big complex models like neural networks? Do they use these too, or do they have their own tricks?
Great question. While you can apply L1, L2 penalties to the weights in neural networks, they have another really powerful and maybe more common regularization technique called dropout.
Dropout. Heard of it, but how does it actually work?
It's actually a pretty neat idea. During training, for each training example, you randomly drop out, meaning you temporarily disable a certain fraction of the neurons in a layer.
You just turn them off
Layer.
randomly.
Yep. Randomly for each pass. So effectively, the network has to learn to make predictions with different subsets of its neurons active each time. It's almost like you're training a whole ensemble of slightly different, smaller networks simultaneously.
Huh. And what's the benefit of doing that?
The big benefit is that it prevents co-adaptation. That's where neurons become too reliant on specific other neurons being present. Dropout forces each neuron to be more robust, to pull its own weight, because it can't rely on its usual neighbors always being there.
Makes the network less fragile, more generalized.
Exactly. It's considered pretty much essential for training large, deep neural networks effectively, especially if your data set isn't massive or if it's a bit noisy.
Okay, dropout sounds quite sophisticated. Are there any simpler regularization methods that are still really effective? Maybe something almost obvious?
Oh, definitely. Don't underestimate the power of early stopping.
Early stopping. That sounds straightforward.
It is, and incredibly effective. The idea is simple. You monitor your model's performance not just on the training data, but crucially, on a separate validation set.
Right, the holdout set.
Exactly. And you keep training the model as long as its performance on the validation set is improving. But the moment that validation performance starts to get worse, even if the training performance is still getting better, you stop.
Ah, so you pull the plug before it starts overfitting to the training data and losing generalization.
Precisely. You see how that training error is still going down, but the validation error starts creeping up. That's your signal. Stop training. You've likely found the sweet spot just before it went too far.
It's like hitting the brakes just before the car skids off the road into overfitting territory.
That's a perfect analogy. And here's a pro tip. Early stopping plays really well with others. Combine it with L1, L2, dropout. Whatever else you're using, it's almost always a good idea to monitor that validation loss and stop early. Maximum gain, minimal effort, really.
That's great practical advice. You know, stepping back from the specific techniques for a moment, I remember reading something about maybe a deeper, more philosophical way to view regularization. Something from Professor Yaser Abu-Mostafa.
Ah, yes. Professor Abu-Mostafa has some really insightful ways of explaining this. It helps move from just the what the math to the why.
How does he frame it?
He often explains regularization through a geometric lens. He talks about it as fundamentally constraining the hypothesis space.
Constraining the hypothesis space.
Yeah.
What does that mean in practice?
Think of all the possible models, all the possible sets of parameters your algorithm could learn. That's your hypothesis space. Without regularization, it might be huge, allowing for incredibly complex, wiggly functions. Regularization, he says, is like putting a fence around complexity.
A fence around complexity. I like that image.
Yeah, it defines a smaller region within that huge space. It says, okay, you can learn, but only solutions within this boundary are acceptable. These simpler, smoother solutions inside the fence are preferred, even if a more complex solution outside the fence fits the training data perfectly.
Because that perfect fit might just be noise.
Exactly. It's a practical constraint. It acknowledges that the best model, according to the training data, might not actually be the best model for the real world. You're intentionally limiting the model's power to prevent it from chasing noise.
So it's not just a mathematical trick, it's a deliberate choice about what kinds of solutions we even consider valid.
Precisely. And this really reinforces a crucial point. Regularization isn't some magic silver bullet you just sprinkle on. It's an art.
An art.
Well, yeah, choosing the right kind of regularization, tuning its strength, it requires understanding your data, understanding your problem. You can't just blindly apply L1 to everything. The best results come when the choice of regularization, that fence, aligns with what you know or suspect about the underlying reality you're trying to model.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about making informed choices based on the context.
Yeah.
So for listeners wanting to apply these ideas, wanting to get better at this art, what are some...
Because the penalties are based on the coefficient sizes. If your features are on vastly different scales, like one ranges from 0 to 1 and another from 0 to 1,000 times, the penalty will unfairly punish the coefficients associated with the larger scale features. You need to standardize or normalize your features before applying regularization. Make it a fair comparison.
Right, put everything on a level playing field. Makes sense. Tip 3.
Third, watch your validation loss, not just training accuracy. It's easy to get excited when your training accuracy hits 99%, but that might mean nothing if your validation loss is going up. The validation set is your reality check. It tells you how well the model actually generalizes. Focus on that.
Good reminder. Don't get fooled by training performance.
Yeah.
And the last tip.
Fourth, log your experiments. Seriously. Whether you use fancy tools like MLflow or weights and biases or just a simple spreadsheet, track what you try. What regularization did you use? What lambda value? What were the results? This helps you learn systematically, avoid repeating mistakes, and build intuition over time.
Excellent. Tune lambda, scale features, watch validation loss, and log everything. Very actionable. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it feels like the big takeaway isn't just about specific formulas. It's more about this underlying philosophy, isn't it? Regularization is like telling your model, look, you don't need to be absolutely perfect on the data I trained you on. You just need to be useful on data you haven't seen.
That's a great way to put it.
It's really not about flexing how complex a model you can build. It's about earning generalization, making something that works reliably out there in the wild.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave folks with. Consider how this philosophy, this idea of useful over perfect, or maybe constrained simplicity over unbridled complexity, applies elsewhere.
Beyond machine learning.
Yeah. Where else in problem solving, or even in life, could we benefit from consciously constraining the hypothesis space? From putting up a fence around complexity to guide ourselves towards solutions that are not just theoretically optimal in some narrow criteria, but are actually robust, sustainable, and, well, useful in the messy, real world. Something to mull over.